Pediria que aumente os assentos, por favor. Queria inicialmente agradecer a presença de todas e de todos para os nossos convidados estrangeiros. Eu explico que no Brasil nós começamos os eventos normalmente com meia hora de atraso. E aqui nós estamos começando com 15 minutos de atraso, vamos chamar acadêmico. E, portanto, as pessoas vão continuar chegando. O bom do Brasil é que nós começamos atrasado, mas às vezes não, especialmente festa, não tem hora para terminar. Mas aqui nós temos hora para terminar, então vamos dar início ao nosso segundo simpósio internacional do STJ de Direito dos Povos Indígenas. Quem precisar de tradução, os fones estão disponíveis. Eu sou Antônio Herman Benjamin, presidente do Superior Tribunal de Justiça.
I am Chief Justice Herman Benjamin, and it's the great writer of the Second International Symposium of the National High Court on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, Indigenous Peoples Law, with a very busy schedule and agenda. I want to make the most to say that I have two of my colleagues, justices of the Ministry of the National High Court and the Ministry of Justice. One of them is a wonderful photographer, actually. I myself have photographs that he took and gifted me in my cabinet, and Justice Mr. Gislai, that are both extremely sensitive to this event's subject. So here at the table we have Funai's president of the National Foundation of the Indigenous Peoples that will be speaking in name of the Indigenous peoples. We have Dr. Marlava Jovcelovic, as director of UNESCO in Brazil, and us as the STJ have many events in partnership with UNESCO. And dear Marlova Leto is always a great peer at these events. We have Ambassador Sophie Davies, Ambassador for Australia and Brazil, also a great friend of our court. And we should remember that this event is Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, and USA. And Canada, of course. I was about to say your name. So we have Ambassador Emmanuel Kamarianakis from Canada, another great friend, and is always present at the STJ's, the National High Court events. And before I hand over to my fellow roundtable colleagues, I'll speak in the name of the institutions that are co-organizing this symposium. I would like to thank the diplomatic corps that is present here. We have several countries represented here. I would like to especially thank the Ambassador Norman Ortiz from Costa Rica, Ambassador Stefan Scholz from Austria, Ambassador Romulo Acurio from Peru, Ambassador Emmanuel Kamarianakis, that I've already mentioned, from Canada, Ambassador Xu Qingzhao from China, Ambassador Sophie Davis from Australia, that I have already mentioned as well. Ambassador Adolfo Castellanos from Cuba. Ambassador Manteia Carancun from Slovenia. Ambassador Ahmed Mohamed Al-Shabani from Qatar. Ambassador Marianne Schugraf from the European Union. Ambassador Mike Halil from Egypt. Ambassador Ángela Guterres Viegas Carrascalón from East Timor. Ambassador Yu Yong Hong Prak from Cambodia. Ambassador Alejandro Cardoso from Mexico, and several other diplomats that I would like to thank for being here. I'd also like to thank the indigenous leaderships that are and leaders that are here, many of whom will be speaking during this event. And our idea with the second symposium is to give voice not just to the indigenous peoples, but to indigenous peoples' law and rights. And this is something that is fundamental for our country. I will later on speak a little bit further on the events program, and it's an honor to hand over to the National Foundation Indigenous Peoples, FUNAI, Joênia Wapichana. I know the president's lands, Joênia Wapichana's lands, and it's a wonderful place in this vast country of ours, and she will be able, obviously, to speak better about these lands to which she belongs. So I hand over to the FUNAI's president. Good afternoon, everyone. Chief Justice Herman Benjamin, President of the National High Court and of the Federal Justice Council, a friend, a defender of the indigenous peoples of nature, Madam Marlova Noleto, Director and UNESCO representative in Brazil, our FUNAI partner for over 20 years for protection of culture and the indigenous peoples' rights. Ambassador Sophie Davies, Australian ambassador in Brazil, that visited FUNAI today. I'd like to greet Ambassador Emmanuel Kamarianakis from the Canadian Embassy. Yes, he's here, he's present, I see him now. I'd also like to greet all those present here. I believe Judge Frederico Jr. is here, President of the Magistrates Association. I'd like to greet all judges and participants, our indigenous leaders, our Yanomami, Davi Kopenawa, and the family of our Chief Raoni that are also here. I'd like to greet everyone, all that are participating in this second international symposium, and also congratulate Justice Herman Benjamin for bringing this international dialogue that is promoted by the STJ and dedicated to the indigenous people's law and rights, which is the day that we celebrate on the 9th of August. Congratulations, Justice. This is a fundamental opportunity for us to reaffirm the Brazilian state's obligation with the Constitution of 1988 that recognizes the original rights of the indigenous people on these lands that we have traditionally occupied, our culture, our habits, and the way we live, the means of living. And this is extremely important to affirm this, because we are part of this country with all the specificities, but also with our rights that are declared to all Brazilians. The indigenous peoples have an estimated population of over 1,700,000 people. 700,000 people, according to the latest census of the Brazilian Statistics Institute. And so the number of people that declared themselves as such has doubled since the last census. And it's hundreds of different peoples, several countries, over 200 languages spoken. And these are all present in the different Brazilian biomes, be it in the Amazon, in the Pantanal, in the Cerrado, in the Pampas. And this data that we have put forth also gives you a dimension to notice the cultural diversity as well as the geographic diversity. And that gives us a very big challenge, which is implementing the public policies, especially the indigenous one. Indigenous lands nowadays represent about 14% of the national territories. A percentage that I believe still leaves a lot to be recognized. In the Amazon alone, just to have an idea of the 14%, 98.7% are in the Brazilian Amazon. I am from the Amazon. Justice Herman had an opportunity to visit our lands, not just a small area, but several areas. He slept there. He saw the stars there. He fought with us for the demarcation of indigenous territories and lands. And it's extremely important to say, Justice, to say that this relationship with the indigenous peoples, an intercultural relationship based on respect, on knowing what we have in Brazil. And I would say that indigenous peoples are really preserved indigenous territory. And the demarcation gives this importance because it is with the demarcation of the territories that these lands can be preserved. And through the light of the indigenous people themselves that are the true day-to-day guardians of biodiversity, of forests are actually standing still, protectors of water, and that give an ecological balance that is extremely important to be established as a policy and a strategy to face this climate crisis that we are all going through. It's an alert that our chiefs, our shamans, and others from our communities, leaders have said. And it's important to have this change in human behavior, in a country's priorities, and especially the importance to insert indigenous peoples in the administrative plans of the countries, but also to insert their law and rights as a priority that is necessary to implement and respect. So Chief Justice and Justice Herman Benjamin, a historical event for the first time, FUNAI, National Indigenous Peoples Foundation, that is gonna complete its 50th year since it was founded and has gone through several different phases. But in the current mandate, the President Lula's mandate, it is the first time that an indigenous woman or even an indigenous person at all that takes over this foundation, which is myself. And it's also important to mark that under Lula's current mandate, they created an extremely important ministry that strengthens the FUNAI, but indigenous people's rights as well, and is the Ministry of Indigenous People that is presided by Minister Guajajara, that is an indigenous woman herself. And together we try to advance in our constitutional rights. These institutional advances are not just historical benchmarks, nor are they just to show that there are indigenous people in Brazil, but they're strategic to reaffirm the indigenous people's protagonism, their resistance, their resilience, and their ideas, formulating public policies, but also in contributing in the decision-making within our country. And it is this public policy implementation that confers us the legitimacy but effectiveness of the rights. FUNAI, I believe there are ambassadors that are here for the first time. I would first of all like to welcome them into our country here. Brazil is an indigenous land, and to share importance, not just today for FUNAI, because FUNAI has, first of all, its responsibility in the demarcation and protection of indigenous lands. And in this international symposium, we're talking about the Indigenous Peoples Law. And there's a part of the government that treats with the central prioritizing the law of indigenous people has been through FUNAI, so that's why it's so important to strengthen and ensure that the indigenous people participate of this public management. And supporting this process, FUNAI is also sharing indigenous management and governance so that I can have a holistic look on that, but also on territorial management. Nowadays, we have 571 indigenous lands that are being currently legalized and recognized. And within FUNAI, with indigenous management, we have already reactivated working groups. And now we have 156 work groups in the field. So that shows that FUNAI is working, it's in the field, so that indigenous people can have their territories legalized. And we still have over 500 requests to actually start the studies and analysis. That shows that we still have a very large challenge ahead of us. Unfortunately, despite our advances, FUNAI had its capacities reduced in the past years, and that we are now trying to rebuild these processes, respecting this constitutional obligation of demarking the lands. And it's also important that aside from strengthening all of this, we must face the forces that are trying to send us backwards, such as legal decrees establish the demarcation procedures, and these forces that are working against that and that are trying to go backwards to even limit the technical capacity of FUNAI's organization itself. FUNAI is a technical organization. It does anthropologic studies, and all the legalization and demarcation lines go through an extremely legal analysis that is supported in evidence, legislation, in laws, and our doctrines. And some legislative changes or attempts of changes try to ensure that this work by FUNAI is lost, or that it takes even more time. And the longer it takes, the more we are putting at risk indigenous lives, but also delaying this fight for indigenous people's rights and lands. This is why I reaffirm that the legal branches role, my dear magistrates and Justice Herman, has been fundamental to avoid setbacks and avoid losing historical benchmarks and victories that treats about the human rights that Brazil ratified in 2004 by the ILO, and so that the indigenous people can have their previous free consultation according to our principles, so that indigenous people cannot suffer their rights being violated. Aside from the consultation, the convention itself talks about the participation and the administrative instances of the countries. So it's important to always evoke that we already have legislations that put us in situations where we can defend ourselves but also participate. And to conclude, Justice, I don't know how long I actually have to speak here. Please do let me know. But I wanted to say that we are facing quite a dangerous challenge nowadays. It goes beyond the timeline thesis. I wish Justice Barroso were here to hear this, but that is someone who is considered a defender of our democracy and our federal constitution, and that the Supreme High Court, no, the Supreme federal court has already considered the temporal benchmark, the time thesis, illegal and anti-constitutional, that tries to restrict the territorial rights, and that this do not consider the historical violence of the Brazilian state against the indigenous people. Likewise, we still have a lot to discuss and debate, but within the National Congress, even nowadays, currently, we have, together with the Human Rights Commission in the Federal Chamber, we have the Bill of Law 1331 that intends to open indigenous lands to research and exploitation, that tries to overcome the decree that exists that regulates the FUNAI's police's power, this power that is so necessary so that FUNAI, we did have a constitutional obligation of protecting the indigenous territories and the indigenous people's rights and laws, and trying to compromise the institutional capacity of the foundation against invasions and illegal activities. So it is important, obviously, recognize the advancements, but also the threats. To recognize so that we can have a fight from equal to equal. Unfortunately, our political representation of indigenous peoples are still a minority. It's also important to recognize that the restructuring process the FUNAI has received, and I would like to congratulate our current government in the name of President Lula, as well as the indigenous organizations that try to search with the Supreme Federal Court this restructuring that was essential so that the indigenous people can have a safer and faster connection with the a stronger connection to the government and dialogue, and where we had a final first public competition so that FUNAI can have at least 30% of these 500 openings at the institution for indigenous people. This innovative, never have we had a public organization that allocated 30% of its openings to indigenous civil servants. Nowadays, we're receiving more, and new civil servants are all going to help have the necessary attention and connection between the government and the organization, the peoples, and to tend to social protection. These openings promote not just representativity, but the recognition of the diversity that makes up our FUNAI. Furthermore, we are ensuring that for the first time, you can imagine, FUNAI is 57 years old, and there was no career plan of the civil service that exert that part of indigenous defenders. Nowadays, those who work in defense of indigenous people now have their career plans. And it's important to ensure that these advances that are taking place, that they cannot be deleted and have setbacks. I'd like to greet our international community here, the ambassadors present that have opened alliances. There are cooperations with the UNDP, with UNESCO, as well as the legal branch tending to social rights. And this is how the indigenous people are being respected according to their specificities. Together with the National Justice Council, we've been able to advance the recognition of the word and name indigenous itself. The last event we have in the CNJ, I could include the name Wapixana in my birth certificate, which wasn't possible before. So these partnerships, the cooperation, the advancing of indigenous policy is extremely important, show that we can have a relationship that is respectful with indigenous peoples and their rights and laws. And this is important to put into practice in concrete cases, partnerships with the legal branch, with civil organization, with the government itself. We are advancing in terms of implementation of rights. I wanted to say that it's extremely important to say that these engagements that are taking place with the legal branch is extremely important. With the government's action last year, this year, we have advanced with 7 actions to remove intruders from indigenous lands, And we've been following the actual handing over indigenous territories to the indigenous people, and this is in accordance with the federal constitution. I would like to highlight that the STJ, there's the recognition that this ownership, be it collective or individual, is enough to justify the union's action for nice action, aside from bringing the competency to the federal justice. This is very important for the several conflicts of interest on indigenous matters. It's innovative. It reinforces all of this, and there are other examples I could cite here, but I'd like to say that it is extremely important to have sentencing such as the one we had recently that removed the temporal mark thesis from being applied, and aside from the decision of the Supreme Court, we have the challenge of the 14701, but we're going to continue fighting for the respect and the rights of indigenous peoples. I'd like to thank here, together with FUNAI's civil servants,
all the partnerships that FUNAI has had in a variety of projects and the judiciary branch to bring access to justice to indigenous people. But I would just like to reaffirm the centrality of the indigenous people as a pillar of the democratic rule of law. This strengthens cooperation between branches, between institutions, and the civil society to guarantee that these advances are not attacked and are not stepped back. I'd just like to wish Justice Herman Benjamin that this symposium that is so significant now in this month of August, that it be a fertile space for the exchange of experiences, reflections, and above all, for the construction of paths that may consolidate the protection of indigenous peoples as an essential condition for democracy, justice, and peace. Congratulations, Minister, for this initiative and for giving us this opportunity of having this event and to show that we have our spaces and our visibilities that we want so much. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you, President Joênia Wapichana. She was the first indigenous woman to become a law graduate in Brazil. I don't think enough people know this. And now we have a growing number of indigenous people who have law degrees and who are acting in the judiciary areas, that people going into their master's degrees, into their PhDs, and starting in their legal careers. But she was the pioneer. Two numbers that the FUNAI's president has highlighted that I think are quite important for us Brazilians. First, this country has 350 indigenous people, 306, sorry, indigenous people. Indigenous groups, maybe more. But that is over 300 ethnicities. They speak 274 languages, possibly more. They're not dialects. Oftentimes, indigenous people who live not that far from each other speak completely different languages. This means with these numbers that we are not a country with a single people group. And it's important for us Brazilians to understand this, not just in the sense of the numbers, but what the Constitution and the legislation states, and the role of judges is fundamental in this process. Allow me to thank the presence of Ambassador Vusi Mazimbela from South Africa, my dear friend. I see him here now, and of Ambassador Susan Kleebank, who is the Asia Pacific Secretary of our Ministry of Foreign Relations, and a great interfere in all the activities that the STJ has with countries in Asia and Pacific. Here at the table, we also have, as we've already mentioned before, Davi Kopenawa, who I believe everyone knows. Davi will be speaking today, and so I'll be able to present him more complete. And Yakokona Metutieri, the Vice President of the Haoni Institute, will also be speaking here in our Congress. I'd like to greet my colleague, Justice Marcelo Navarro. And without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to Ambassador Sophie Davis, the first woman to be Ambassador of Australia to Brazil.
Boa tarde a todos e todas.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here with all of you. Thank you, Justice Herman Benjamin, for this day. This is the second international symposium, and with this focus on Indigenous Peoples Law, which is a very important theme for Australia as well. In Australia, we have the mission of we have the tradition of recognizing indigenous people in the beginning of this event. So I'm going to follow the events, this tradition, and I'm going to pay my homage to the leaders of the past and the present and the new generations that are present here today. I'd like to thank Chief Justice Herman Benjamin for the invitation given to Australia so that Australia could participate in this important gathering. Since we started around a year ago, as we said around a year ago, it's an essential opportunity to widen our common understanding, especially given COP30 happening here in Brazil this year. It's a great honor to have here Mr. Kevin Smith, President of the National Native Land Titles Court in Australia, who faced a long trip from Brisbane to Brasilia to participate in the symposium. And I know that after his sister, he is the first lawyer in his land in the north of Australia, in the Torres Strait Island. President Smith is a lawyer with wide experience in the area of Indigenous law, and he is the first Indigenous man to occupy the presidency of this Native Land Title Court, which has a central role in the application of the Native Land Titles Law in Australia. Tomorrow, he will be a part of the panel on strategies of preservation of cultural heritage, and certainly he will bring very relevant contributions. This year is an important year for Australia and Brazil because we celebrate 80 years of diplomatic relationship. And thank you, Ambassador Susan Kleebank, for being here today. Our countries share a lot of similarities. We are both continentally sized, located in the southern hemisphere with large economies, a diversity of climates, fauna, and flora. We are also multi-ethnic societies with deep indigenous roots and a very rich history and culture. Australia is proud to be home of one of the most ancient civilizations and continuity of the world, which goes back to over 65,000 years. Australia defends for a long time now that the effective participation of indigenous people is essential for justice and integrity of human rights. As FUNAI's President Joina has just mentioned, we believe that indigenous people should be protagonists and should benefit from the international system. In this sense, we'd like to greet Brazil's emphasis in the climate mission and the widening of the space of civil society's participation during COP30. During the pre-COP in October, here in Brasilia, you will receive the ambassador of the Australian First Nations, Justin Mohammed. In October 15th, he will participate in an event with Minister Sonia Guajajara to highlight the importance of traditional knowledge, and everyone is invited, of course. The indigenous people of all of our regions have a fundamental role given the large challenges of our times, especially climate change. Accumulated knowledge on land, forests, and the oceans are a valuable tool for the promotion of sustainable development and to face climate environmental impacts. That's why Australia is strongly committed to host COP31 in our region with Pacific Islands and in partnership with them next year, and with our people, the First Nations peoples of Australia. The indigenous Australian communities have a historic community with Pacific peoples, and their contribution to our understanding and action on the climate is possible to measure. So COP31 will be an opportunity to share this knowledge and to guarantee partnerships and concrete results for indigenous people in the global scenario. To wrap up, I have no doubt that this symposium will allow for the exchange of best practices and will contribute to the construction of common ground and the capacity for new opportunities for the protection and rights of indigenous people, not just here in Brazil, but throughout the world. Once again, I'd like to thank Chief Justice Herman Benjamin and the National High Court STJ for organizing this event. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. Before we proceed, I'd like to thank the presence of Justice Benedito Gonçalves, my colleague here at the STJ, and who is also the director of our National Judges School. For those of you who don't know the structure of the Brazilian judiciary branch, the National Judges School, in fact, is a part of the flowchart of the National Justice Court. They're part of the organization of the National Justice Court. And now I have the pleasure of passing the floor to Emmanuel Karianakis, Ambassador of Canada, and a dear friend of mine. No, you need to speak right into the mic. Is that better? Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. A pleasure to be here. Boa tarde a todas e todos. Começo.
I'd like to start by greeting the Chief Justice of Herman Benjamin, my dear friend. I'd like to congratulate the National High Court for hosting this event that gathers indigenous leaders and authorities of the three branches, multilateral institutions, and academics with the focus of the recognition of indigenous rights and justice, a priority theme for Brazil and for Canada. It is an honor to participate in this event, especially with the virtual presence of the Supreme Court Justice Michelle Bonsovic virtually. She is the first indigenous person named to the highest court of our nation, a member of the Adenak Nation coming from the Franco indigenous community in Franco, Ontario. She started acting in 2022 as a judge in the Supreme Court of Ontario. She's specialized in mental health, human rights, and indigenous rights. Her path and career is a watershed moment for the inclusion of indigenous people in the Canadian judiciary branches. She'll be sharing her experiences about the justice system and Indigenous people in Canada. Listening to Indigenous perspectives is fundamental for our government. Just like Brazil, Canada has a history marked by the challenges related to colonialism. Indigenous people resisted forced dislocation, the loss of their territories, and the criminalization of their cultures. Between 1880 and 1986, assimilation policies such as the resident school system caused severe abuses against Indigenous children. In response, Canada has created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which resulted in a formal apologies in 2008 and 94 recommendations for actions. Ever since then, the country has sought to rebuild its relationship with the Indigenous people of Canada with a basis on respect, recognition, and partnership. In 2021, we incorporated the UN Declaration on Indigenous People Rights to our federal constitution and created the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, celebrated September 30th. Also in 2021, Mary Simon, an Inuk woman, was named the General Governor of Canada, the first Indigenous person to occupy that role. The General Governor of Canada represents the Chief of State of the country and has an important role in the public life, democratic life of Canada. Even though it's an especially ceremonial function, it does have responsibilities such as approving laws, opening parliament, and promoting national values. Naming Mary Simon was a historical moment showing the commitment of Canada with reconciliation and inclusion of Indigenous voices into the highest institutions of the nation. We also know that there's a lot ahead of us. Reconciliation is a long, arduous process, but it is a necessary process. Canada, as many countries, given all the new geopolitical challenges, in response seeks to strengthen its economy and to expand partnerships, always in partnership with Indigenous people, with structured consultation and active participation. This partnership is essential. The new construction law in Canada, sanctioned in 2025, seeks to accelerate strategic infrastructure projects throughout the country. Even though the government says that the Indigenous rights are at the center of the legislation, leaders are alert that the hurry might weaken Indigenous rights. The challenge now is to guarantee that economic progress happens with inclusion and listening and respect to ancestral rights. Building the future needs not only speed, but also collective wisdom. The same vision also guides Canada's international action. In 2024, in G20, Canada announced a contribution of 54 million of the UN Brazil Fund for Amazon development, becoming the first donor to this initiative. This donation was for young Indigenous people and to improve the resiliency of their communities. So it's inspiring to see Brazil on the path of reconciliation with respect and dialogue. We hope to see more exchange between our peoples, sharing experiences and best practices. A more peaceful world and a more prosperous world demands the indigenous, a relevant participation of Indigenous people, and so this commitment is extremely important. This is a generational transformation project, and it begins with all of us here in this room. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Ambassador Emmanuel Kamarianakis, and I now have the honor of giving the floor to Dr. Marlova, the director of UNESCO in Brazil. And we know the importance of UNESCO for this theme of our Congress here today. So, be it with the designation of material or immaterial cultural heritage, or in UNESCO's work regarding education, fundamentally the education that we all need. With the floor, Dr. Marlova Yoshilovich. Good afternoon, Chief Justice Benjamin, the President of the National Justice Council. I'd like to greet Ambassador Manuel, who's right next to me, Ambassador Sophia, my dear Joania, our partner at FUNAI, our our dear David Copenaua and Acoconia, all the ambassadors, Justice Benedito, and all of you who are watching us virtually, the Canadian judge that was mentioned here. Well, for UNESCO, it's a big privilege, Justice Herman, to participate in this meeting that gathers different perspectives towards justice and the rights of indigenous people. This is a theme that is very dear to UNESCO and for the UN as a whole. Our commitment with this agenda is based on the policy of collaboration with the indigenous people that was instituted in 2021. It is based on the universal defense of justice, the human rights, and the rule of law without any sort of difference for ethnicity, gender, or relation as an ethical quandary that cannot be separated from the respect to human dignity. So their indigenous people are the managers of our flora, fauna, and cultures of the world, and this is a very important part of the Agenda 2030 of the UN. And the normative instruments of UNESCO, such as our conventions from 1970, 1972, 2003, 2005, which are the conventions that have to do with natural heritage, cultural heritage, immaterial heritage of humanity, the Convention of Cultural Diversity, they all give a solid foundation for the protection and valuation of indigenous heritage, including the return of important cultural assets such as the return of the Tupinamba mantle, which was very important. Brazil worked so hard to get it back, as well as the recognition of living traditions and oral traditions and the rituals of indigenous people as heritage. And here in Brazil, UNESCO would like to highlight very happily and very honored and a lot of honor this 2-decade partnership with FUNAI. Joanna has already mentioned this here, always looking at the preservation and the safeguard of cultural heritage, cultural diversity, linguistic heritage of the indigenous people. This project that safeguards linguistic and cultural heritage of indigenous people beyond borders, as well as those people who are of recent contacts. This is a concrete example of this action, training indigenous researchers, recording and developing libraries of the communities and spreading knowledge on cultural and linguistic diversity of the indigenous population of Brazil. Advancing in this agenda of rights is absolutely fundamental. The theme of this seminar, of this International Symposium on Indigenous Peoples Law, is very symbolic in its nature. Yes, we must advance in this agenda of rights and recognize, as our dear partners have already taught, the importance of the protagonism of indigenous peoples in this discussion so that we may in fact respect what they demand from us. It's not about us. Or nothing about us without us. This is something that I learned from the very beginning when I started working with FUNAI, and that is quite important that we always have this respect. I'd also like to highlight in this context the importance of the International Indigenous Language Decade. We're in the midst of this decade, and it was instituted by the General Assembly of the UN from 2022 to 2032, and UNESCO is the leading agency for this decade, calling to action with the proposal of preserving, revitalizing, promoting, and documenting indigenous languages throughout the world as living systems of knowledge and identity, guaranteeing that they may be used freely in every environment and every context of life, from education to the justice system.
It's not a symbolic celebration, as we like to highlight, but rather of a strategic benchmark conceived from the very start with direct participation of indigenous peoples and trying to respect the multilinguistic context and the importance of searching and attempting to preserve languages of even the more remote areas, peoples. Brazil has been having a role that is highlighted in this decade with one of the biggest linguistic language diversities in the country. It was one of the first to adopt a national plan built in a participative manner with a broad presence of indigenous leaderships and the engagement of public institutions, academia, and cultural organizations. And of course, it's always important to celebrate the creation of the Indigenous Peoples Ministry under President Lula's current government, that under the leadership of Minister Sônia Guajajara, has been strengthening the indigenous languages recognition as a living heritage. Language, of course, is also we must not forget, one of the main means of access to justice. I see here next to me the translation, the interpretation that is taking place, and the importance that we always remind ourselves and remember that language is the first means of communication. It's what makes us human. And when the freedom using one's own language is not guaranteed, this limits the freedom of thought, of opinion, freedom of expression, as well as access to one's rights and public services. So I'm really happy, Justice Herman, that we are once more partners here. You are always at the vanguard of the fundamental subjects to advance an agenda for rights in Brazil. This time, the indigenous peoples one. And thank you very much for the constant present partnership with UNESCO. And I'd like to conclude by saying that no future can be sustainable if we leave behind entire communities and their knowledge. We must guarantee that no one be left behind, and that languages and ancestral indigenous peoples' knowledge always be respected. Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to declare this first opening session closed, and I request that my colleagues please take their seats. Back the we can stay. Actually, the three of you can remain. I'd like to invite, without further ado, the Vice President of the STJ, Justice Luiz Felipe Salomão, who is here. He is going to be chairing this next panel. And before we change, I'm going to invite to speak my colleague Joe Williams, who is going to very soon be in session at the Supreme Court in New Zealand in a few minutes. And so he's probably so anxious, as anxious as us here, with the possibility of him possibly not being able to participate. So
the court sitting in a few minutes, and we would like to hear from you. So you have the floor.
Tēnā koutou kei aku rangatira e noho mai nā I te whenua taurikura o Prahiria. Mihi mai nei ngā tāngata whenua o tēnā kāinga. e tangi ana ki ngā mate e aloha ana ki ngā kanohi ora. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Greetings, everybody. I hope you can hear me. And thank you, Antonio, for that introduction. I said in my native language that I greet you who live in that beautiful land of Brazil, and in particular, I acknowledge the ancestors of the people whose authority remains in that vast land, the indigenous people of that place. I greet your ancestors, and I grieve for their loss alongside you. And in this conversation, I bring my ancestors with me and ask that you grieve for their loss as I grieve for yours. My name is Joe Williams. I have a kind of mixed background. I am half Irish and half Maori, which means I got colonized by the English twice. So I'm very familiar with the process of colonization, and I want to talk about some very basic ideas and leave the more learned and technical discussion to others better suited than me to have those conversations with you. And if I can also warn you that I am going to be in court in a little over half an hour in quite a big case in my country. So I won't speak for very long. And if I appear a little distracted, that might be because the Chief Justice is knocking on the door, telling me to come to work when I'd rather be sitting here talking to you all. Let me start with this idea of the indigenous. The idea of the indigenous
A ideia
is an idea that developed
de
alongside the phenomenon of colonization. So it's an idea that's 500 odd years old. Of course, different words were used to articulate what the colonizers were seeing: native, Aboriginal, Indian, strangely, since they were nowhere near India. But these were all ways of articulating that what they were seeing, those humans that those colonizers were seeing, were other. It was an underpinning of their striking alienness. So what was it about these indigenous peoples that they saw in the Americas, in Australasia, in the Pacific, in Africa, and to some extent in Asia? What was it about them that made them so alien to these travelers from Europe? What I've seen in many years of working with, living with, and speaking with indigenous peoples is this set of common characteristics that speak to what indigenous means now and what it must have meant to those sailors who came over from Portugal and Spain 500 odd years ago, and then their German, Belgian, Dutch, English, Scots, Irish, and so on, and French compatriots who followed them. First of all, these alien Aboriginal people were embedded in place. They lived in a place that was alive. Alive in their imagining and alive in their law. They lived collectively. The bond that joined them was usually kinship. And their law and their culture saw the divine in everything. That place, that people was itself God. And the indigenous people these colonizers met had deep memory. These were people that lived collectively, saw that all was divine, saw that all was alive, saw that all was their relation. And they expressed that in the languages they spoke, in the development of a unique vocabulary that expressed these deep ideas. Of course, on top of that deep set of fundamental realities, ultimate reality, you might say, they built economies, they built law, they built ways in which political power was exercised, they resolved conflict when they had them. But you can see why, when the colonizers met a people like this, they wondered whether they were human at all, because their eyes and their hearts were so different. At least so different from the reality of peoples who were experiencing the Renaissance, the First Industrial Revolution, and the Second Industrial Revolution. This was so different. You see, the colonizer, in its various forms from the 15th century through to the, I suppose, the early 20th century, certainly the late 19th century, had come to a completely different view of human reality, come to the view of place as commodity and servant of the human, of the collective as individuals, and of relationships that were not relationships of kinship, but relationships of transaction. Of course, this system with which we're all familiar now, because it ends up running the planet, unlocks a massive flowering of material wealth, of growth, and of possibility. But what it lacked, by comparison to the alien and the indigenous, was the continuity of connection, the continuity of belonging, the continuity of memory, and of stability and security. Common features that indigenous peoples, both today living in traditional ways and in the past, celebrate about their realities. The strength of connection to place and each other, the strength of belonging, the security and comfort of memory, and the power of stability in life. So you can see it's hard to imagine two sets of peoples coming together being any more different than when the European world itself going through revolutions and the indigenous world collided. The end of the 15th century, the 16th century, the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th century, and they're still colliding. The collision continues with or without law, with or without the formalism of law. You'll all be familiar with colonial histories that involved rape, pillage, and no law, until the law eventually arrives and introduces its formalism, which may or may not be protective of the victims, but is nonetheless law. So not only is there a collision between the indigenous and the colonizer, you see there is also a collision within the colonizer. A collision when these worlds meet and all is up for the taking between the moral self and the self-centered self. And this, of course, is what in modern terms we call human rights. The contest between power that is moral and power that is merely and nakedly selfish. Both, of course, can be lawful. But we as judges sit at the fulcrum between those choices. A fulcrum that can be occasionally very uncomfortable. And for Indigenous judges, like myself and my sister Michelle O'Bonsawin, can be impossible. So there are these contradictions that we have to confront as judges. A law that says there are no separate rights in the law for these people. Yet we see before ourselves, we see with our own eyes that Indigenous peoples are actually exercising rights. In fact, whatever the law says. We can have laws that say there is no separate law of Indigenous community, of Indigenous self-government, of self-determination. That would be inconsistent with the unitary nature of law. But we see that expression of self-determination and of sovereignty, in fact, in the communities that have survived the process of colonization. That there is no separate polity in law because that would be inconsistent with equality before the law, when in fact Indigenous communities are expressing law in their ordinary lives. The contradiction that gets found out when one looks at things this way is, what was the extinguishing event? At what point did law's moral self take these things away, if they are persistently being expressed even today? And one of the struggles for judges used to sitting in judgment as expressions of state power is to find such an event when pressed. Often, in fact, the law, when it is trying to project its moral self rather than its selfish self, uses language of continuity and preservation. For example, in my country, we have this thing called the Treaty of Waitangi, entered into in 1840, where the British Crown made particular promises. I won't go into the detail of it because it's not relevant for you, but that document is an expression of law as its moral self. And in Brazil, I understand you have your constitution, which expresses Indigenous laws in an attempt to project the law as a moral phenomenon. These are challenges and contradictions which judges must confront, not hide from. The answers in particular conflicts where we have to deal with these apparently conflicting realities will be for us individually in individual cases. But the challenge for judges is to see the true context, the substance beneath the form, the human reality beneath the words. The challenge for judges, as for humans, I suggest, is to reject the disempowering otherness of immoral law and to embrace the empowering differentness of moral law. There is a difference between law that others and law that acknowledges difference. The challenge for judges is to search for and find the human, the self, in others. Of course, that's true for judging generally. Empathy must be our constant companion. And if we find that, we will realize that the future is in interdependence between the Indigenous and the rest of the world. Which brings me to the last point I want to make before I better go to work. 40% of the world's intact terrestrial ecosystems exist under Indigenous protection. 40%. The Amazon, of course, the boreal forests in the Northern Hemisphere, the great jungles of the Southwest Pacific, Southeast Asia, and in the Congo in Africa, all administered by Indigenous peoples, whether the law recognizes it or not. 40%. Administered and protected by perhaps 2% of the world's population. Now, there's a theme here. Indigenous peoples whose cultures are embedded in place, whose cultures see the divine in all and see themselves as an aspect of the divine, tend to protect the planet. Not because they're special people, but because their laws indicate that that is their responsibility. That their cultures indicate that is their responsibility. And it turns out, the fact that Indigenous peoples are doing that is good for all of us. The colonizers having cut down most of their jungles and destroyed most of their ecosystems. Which brings me to this idea of interdependence. One of the great challenges for us as judges is to think of the relationship between the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous, use that term, not as one of self and other, but as one of interdependent humanity. We must struggle to find in the languages of Indigenous peoples referred to by the representative from UNESCO, the vocabulary we need to see place and planet in a different way. That vocabulary no longer exists in Spanish or Portuguese or English or French. It probably did once. It no longer exists. The vocabulary of belonging and place, of seeing a reality in which the planet will be healthy, that vocabulary is to be found in the languages of Indigenous people. Judges, as it turns out, are the ones who must shine the torch on these things. So we have a saying in my language, ko te pai tawhiti whaia kia tata, ko te pai tata whakamaua kia tina, which means we're a voyaging people, we're a canoe people. The distant horizon, head for it, and you'll reach a close horizon. The close horizon, grab it and hold fast. Life for humans in a healthy planet is becoming an increasingly distant horizon. I invite you as judges to aim your canoes at that distant horizon, and if we're lucky, we'll make it to the close one. Thank you very much. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you very much, Judge Joey, pela sua apresentação.
Thank you very much for your beautiful presentation, such an inspiring theme. I'd like to thank you immensely for this opportunity and to wish you some good work, get some good work done. I hope that you have great work ahead of you, and to say that this idea of interdependence certainly is an idea that will encompass all of the debates here in this journey of learning and knowledge that the National High Court of Brazil will develop today and tomorrow. Thank you so much. Okay, following and not before thanking the invitation that was given to me by Chief Justice Herman Benjamin, who has been developing very relevant work, both in the institutional point of view as in the point of view of creating events such as this that really mark our court as the court of citizenship in its real function, promoting fruitful, intense, open debate on themes that impact our development and our democracy. So congratulations, Justice Benjamin. Congratulations to the staff of the National High Court that I would like to thank in the name of Minister Arnaldo. I'd also like to greet the table made up by people such as David Copenaua, as well as Minister Michel Bonsawin, and by Geraldo Torres. I'm going to be presenting each of them as they speak. I'd also like to reinforce, given the importance of this event, I'd like to register the presence of a variety of ministers, a variety of justices, and our home Justice Benedito Gonçalves, the director of our education school. This is a very important event for the education of our judges. Justice Sebastião Reis, who also studies this theme, Justice Marco Belize, Justice Ribeiro Dantas, Justice Azulay, and Justice Afrânio. All of you, welcome. It's an honor to receive you here and to give this dimension, the presence, first, the dimension of the importance of this event as it was idealized by the National High Court and by Chief Justice Herman Benjamin. To continue, well, at the end, Chief Justice Benjamin, I'm going to be talking a little bit about an experience that I had in the National Justice Council when we had a program called Register, which was the civil registry of vulnerable people, homeless people at first, and later we extended this to those who had more difficulty in actually getting this documentation, which is extremely important for exercising their citizenship. And at the invitation of the prosecutor of a location, we went to Belém de Solimões. So I had the opportunity of carrying out, together with my colleague, a judge from that region, a wedding ceremony, community wedding of indigenous people, as well as in giving documentation IDs to a lot of people. So at the end, I will briefly give a testimony because I learned so much about this. It was a great life lesson. I had the opportunity of being together with the largest indigenous community of Brazil, which is in the Solimões River. So after this, we'd like to call Minister Michelle Gonçalves. She is a member of the Odanak First Nation in Quebec. She used to be a part of the National High Court of Ontario ever since 2017. She speaks French and English. She specialized in a variety of areas throughout her career, among them mental health and human rights. She was named a judge in 2022, and she's the first indigenous person to occupy this seat in Canada's Supreme Court. So it is with immense satisfaction that we pass the floor to Justice Michelle O'Bonsawin.
Hola. Hello. I want to start off by thanking Chief Justice Herman Benjamin for inviting me to speak to you today. And I'll start off by introducing myself, as is our tradition in my Abenaki language. Kwai kwai ni dobak na deliwizi miselis Obansawin na zawi odanak wabanakik alnoba taplawinonia udozari tadzian. So I've said, hello, friends. I'm introducing myself as a proud member of Odanak First Nation, a Turtle Clan member, and my parents are Richard and Diane. What I thought I'd talk to you about in this brief 20 minutes or so is with regard to the Canadian experience of the impact of residential and day schools, how it has impacting and has continued to impact our people with regard to the justice system, and then talk to you about how the Canadian Parliament reacted to different commissions that have studied these issues and case law that has come out of it. I'd like to start off by talking about statistics because I think that they're quite poignant. And in Canada, for you to get an understanding, Indigenous people represent approximately 5% of our population. In 2021, there were a little over 1 million First Nations peoples, 625,000 Métis, and about 70,000 Inuit people. For those of you that are not aware, we are split into a series of provinces, 10 of them, and 3 territories. So in Ontario, we have approximately 22.5% of the population is found of Indigenous people is found in Ontario. Then afterwards, 13.1% in Manitoba, in Saskatchewan, 10.3%, Quebec, 11.3%, and then in our Atlantic provinces, about 7.5%, to end up then afterwards in the territories at 3.3%. We have a significant issue in Canada, whereas we have Indigenous persons are dramatically overrepresented in the Canadian criminal justice system. From 2020 to 2021, Indigenous adults accounted for 31% of admissions to provincial and territorial custody. And during that same time, Indigenous adults accounted for 33% of admissions into federal custody. Overrepresentation is even more pronounced for Indigenous women, who account for 42% of female admissions to provincial and territorial sentenced custodies. So when you think of it, we are approximately 5% of the Canadian population, but in the penitentiary system, 42% of women are Indigenous. And when we're looking by contrast of the proportion of admissions that were recorded of Indigenous peoples between 1978 and 1987, it was only 13.7%. Our youth, we still have also issues related to our youth. So in 2020, 2021, they represented 50% of the youth correctional service admissions. And when we're looking specifically at Quebec, the largest province, one of the largest provinces in Canada, the proportion of Indigenous persons sentenced from imprisonment is nearly double the representation of the Quebec population at 3.5%. And when we look at Saskatchewan, which has a dense Indigenous population, the proportion of Indigenous inmates is 7 times higher than the representation in provincial population. So that's 78% in sentence custody. What are the reasons for this over-incarceration of Indigenous people in Canada? Well, they're attributable to widespread poverty, dislocation, addiction, mental health, and violence within our communities. These are symptoms that are profound, and they are manifestations of the different injuries arising from the impact of colonialism, discrimination, and systemic racism. Justice Melvin Green stated that the trauma is a result of the consequences of traditional lands being appropriated, treaties being dishonored, families being torn apart, and identities being erased. The residential and day school system is one of the many sources of intergenerational trauma in Canada. For decades, Indigenous children were separated from their parents and sent to residential schools to be assimilated into the dominant Euro-Christian Canadian culture. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada issued its seminal report in 2015 that found that the goal was to eliminate Indigenous peoples' distinct legal, social, cultural, religious, and racial entities, and it also described it as a cultural genocide. The legacy of residential schools is reflected in the significant educational, income, health, and social disparities between Indigenous persons and other Canadians. It's also seen in high rates of suicide and family violence, addictive and self-destructive behaviors, and the absence of traditional skills and role models. It's also seen as an over-incarceration of Indigenous people where, and I'm quoting, students who were treated and punished like prisoners in the schools, more specifically residential schools, often graduated to real prisons. For many, the path from residential schools to prison was a short one. The Canadian government had a series of different commissions that looked at this issue starting in the 50s up until the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, the Vien Commission more recently. And in the mid-1990s, the Canadian Parliament responded to this issue of over-representation of Indigenous persons in the criminal justice system by amending our criminal code. Bill C-41 amended the code in 1995. It was proclaimed to force in the next year. And more specifically, we have sentencing provisions that are specific where trial judges must take into consideration under 718(2)E that when imposing a sentence, and I'm just going to read this here, a sentence shall also take into consideration the following principles. And E, all available sanctions other than imprisonment that are reasonable in the circumstances and consistent with the harm done to victims should be considered for all offenders, with particular attention to the circumstances of Indigenous offenders. We also had more recent amendments in 2019 to our bail provisions because in the past, sentencing judges were not necessarily always taking into consideration these individualized principles for Indigenous accused when it came to bail conditions. And in 2009, there was an amendment that really reflected the similar phrasing that we saw for sentencing. When we're looking at the role of a sanction, we're looking at the objectives of a sanction, which are denunciation, retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, restorative justice, rehabilitation, early intervention. What are the issues that judges should be considering? Well, the incarceration of an individual is the last resort. It's only to be ordered when necessary. The questions we should be asking ourselves are, can we reduce the use of imprisonment? Can we increase the use of restorative justice? How do we increase the sensitivity to Indigenous communities, and who plays what role? After these changes came into place in 1995-96, we had the first case to be heard by our Supreme Court called R versus Gladue. And it was the first time in 1999 where the court had to evaluate whether or not a trial judge had appropriately used these sentencing principles. Just to give you a bit of a background, Ms. Gladue was a young woman of only 19 years old, an Indigenous woman. She was a mother of two. She was pregnant with her third child. She was fortunate. She had a supportive family. She didn't have a criminal record other than the exception of a conviction for impaired driving. She was attending alcohol abuse counseling, had upgraded her education, but she did have a hyperthyroid condition that caused her to overreact in very emotional situations. And in the night in question of the event, Ms. Gladue was provoked by the victim, who was her common law spouse. He had told her that he had had a sexual relation with her sister, which then led her to react by stabbing him twice, once in the heart, and it was clear she hadn't intended to harm him. However, after the event took place, she showed signs of remorse. She was accused of murder and pled guilty to manslaughter, and she was sentenced by the trial court to 3 years of imprisonment. When it came to the Supreme Court of Canada, there was a review of what guidelines should be proposed for sentencing judges, and the court issued 2 of them. Firstly, the unique systemic or background factors that may have played a part in bringing the Indigenous offender before the courts had to be considered. And secondly, the types of sentencing procedures and sanctions that could be appropriate in the circumstances of the offender's Indigenous heritage and connection. I have to tell you that a lot of these factors in Canada, you'll often hear someone say, well, they're the Gladue principles. But I have since a couple of years stopped using that sentence of Gladue principles, and now I call them Indigenous sentencing principles. And the reason being is that I know an Indigenous judge out west, which is where this situation happened, who's very close to the Gladue family, and they feel that there's a continued victimization of Ms. Gladue by the Canadian public by constantly referring to sentencing factors for Indigenous accused as Gladue principles. So that is why I call them Indigenous sentencing principles. So coming back to the decision, if those factors were significant, the judge must consider them in order to determine if imprisonment would, 1, serve to deter or to denounce a crime, in a sense that would be meaningful to the community of which the offender is a member. The sentencing judge has to consider the different circumstances surrounding the offense, the accused, the victim, and the community. And the judge must understand the difficulties Indigenous people have faced. Sentencing judge must also impose a sentence that's fit for the offense and the offender. And I have to say, at times, those in the general population that don't understand what the role of Indigenous sentencing principles are in these cases will think that it is a get out of jail card that Indigenous accused will be using, but I can assure you it definitely is not. These sentencing principles are designed to look at the individualized circumstances of the accused, and there are a series of different principles that are required to be evaluated by a sentencing judge, in addition to these under 718(2)E dealing specifically with the Indigenous accused. I also want to let you know that these Indigenous principles apply to all Indigenous people that fall under the scope of our Canadian Charter of Freedoms, Rights and Freedoms, Section 25 and 35, which guarantees specific rights for Indigenous people. And when we look at the definition of Aboriginal peoples under subsection 35(2) of our charter, they are defined as Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. We don't use the term Indian any longer, notwithstanding the fact that the act that deals with all Indigenous issues is called the Indian Act. That's antedated language that we no longer use. When we're looking at restorative justice, we're looking at an approach that focuses on individuals involved in the offense, and we're all community, because when these situations happen, often they'll happen in an Indigenous community where the victim herself or himself will also be an Indigenous person. The Indigenous sentencing principles aim at taking a different approach to sentencing and not necessarily a different result. And in cases where serious offenses are committed, restorative justice is not the only approach the court should consider. What they'll also look at are denunciation and deterrence that at times could be more important in determining the appropriate sentence for an Indigenous offender. The follow-up case that came to our Supreme Court of Canada in 2012 was R versus Ipeely. These included two Indigenous accused, Mr. Ipeely and Mr. Ladue. Mr. Ipeely was an alcoholic with a history of committing violence offenses when intoxicated. He was sentenced to a 6-year imprisonment followed by a long-term supervision order after being designated a long-term offender. And after his release from prison, Mr. Ipeely committed an offense while intoxicated, and he breached his condition of his order, of his long-term supervision order. He was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, less 6 months for pre-sentence custody, and the Court of Appeal dismissed his appeal in that case. Looking now at Mr. Ladue, he was addicted to drugs and alcohol, and he had a history of committing sexual assaults when intoxicated. He was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, followed by, again, a long-term supervision order after being designated a long-term offender also. And also after his release, like Mr. Ipeely, he breached his condition of his order by failing a urinalysis test. And he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, less 5 months for pre-sentence custody. And in that case, a majority of the Court of Appeal allowed his appeal and reduced the sentence from 3 to 1 year's imprisonment. But in these matters, the Supreme Court of Canada had to determine how a fit sentence for a breach of a long-term supervision order in the case of an Indigenous offender should be looked at, because this was not purely just related to sentencing. And it was determined that the trial judge had to apply the principles that were set out under the Act to determine a fit sentence and a proper sentence for these Indigenous accused. The fundamental principle of sentencing is proportionality, and it's tied with the need to maintain a just, peaceful, and safe society, but also with sanctions. And the Supreme Court in this case acknowledged that it had been a decade since the Gladue decision had been issued, and the overrepresentation of Indigenous persons in the criminal justice system continued to worsen. And some of the failure to remedy that problem was attributable to the lower court's fundamental misunderstanding and misapplication of the reasons as they were set out in the Gladue decision. And it was determined that further guidance was required for sentencing and trial judges. And so they looked at the scope of clarifying the Indigenous sentencing principles in two significant ways. Firstly, by noting that an Indigenous offender is not required to establish a causal link between their background factors and the commission of the offense to trigger that analysis under 718(2)(e). And then afterwards, secondly, the Indigenous sentencing principles, they apply to sentencing for all offenses whether they're serious or not, without exception. And a failure for a sentencing or trial judge to consider these sentencing principles will equal an error justifying appellate intervention. And in Mr. Ipili's case, the court determined that rehabilitation was not a relevant sentencing objective and failed to consider his circumstances and as an Indigenous offender. And a sentence of 1 year was deemed appropriate instead. In Mr. Ladu's case, the Court of Appeals decision was well-founded and adequately considered the principles and objectives of sentencing, and his appeal was therefore dismissed because, if you recall, it had already been reduced from 3 to 1 year. Now looking at the application of the Indigenous sentencing principles in practice, well, a court has to look at the information about the offender and the systemic factors that shape their lives. This information could vary considerably from one Indigenous offender to another. And sentencing judge is responsible for ensuring that the information regarding an Indigenous offender's unique circumstances is analyzed. And in practice, the way in which this information is presented to the court and the extent to which it is considered at all varies considerably from one case to another. A sentencing judge is responsible for ensuring that the information regarding these Indigenous offenders and their unique circumstances are well analyzed by the court. But also the Crown and the Defense Counsel also have a role to play, and they have to ensure that the evidence is properly adduced and provided to the sentencing judge. Counsel, they have a duty to bring individualized information before the court in every case, unless the offender expressly waives their right to have it considered. And if counsel doesn't bring forward the evidence, a judge has to attempt to get that information about the offender as an Indigenous person and consider any alternatives to incarceration that could be available either inside or outside of the offender's community. The judge can also take judicial notice of significant issues like the history of colonialism, the impact of displacement and residential and day schools in Canada, and how that history translates into lower educational attainment, lower incomes, higher unemployment, higher rates of substance abuse and suicide, and higher levels of incarceration for Indigenous persons. And individualized information about the Indigenous offender is typically provided in two ways, either by a pre-sentence report, but also under a separate report which is created by a third party, which is the Indigenous Sentencing Provisions Principles Report. The issue with the authors of the Indigenous Sentencing Principles Report is that they're private writers. They don't undergo a consistent training, and the quality and content of these reports vary significantly. Some are great, some are cookie cutter. And the purpose of these two different types of reports, they should not be treated interchangeably, because an individualized sentencing report is not just a sentencing report. It takes out and puts forward the information with regards to the Indigenous offender's healing journey and personal circumstances, with the opposition being the pre-sentencing report that aims to prevent recidivism by conducting a future risk assessment. I'll give you a couple of reflections with regard to the Indigenous sentencing principles. Canadian courts have had difficulty applying them in matters involving Indigenous accused. We have had a significant study in 2016 by two well-respected professors, and one now is the president of the University of Ottawa, Marie-André Denis Boileau and Marie-Ève Sylvestre, where they looked at 635 trials, and they found that only 1/3 of the decisions were the trial judges appropriately looking at these principles. So I see that I'm starting to get out of time, but I wanted to share with you that we do look at these individual Indigenous sentencing principles in a variety of other contexts. So we'll look at them in civil contempt, parole eligibility, dangerous offender applications, extradition appeals, administrative appeals from solitary confinement, and also in the not criminally responsible or unfit to stand trial context. I have provided the conference organizers with slides, and they'll be able to share them with you. That contains a bit more information than what I was able to share with you today. But again, Ulina Nawal Mazi, thank you very much for having asked me to attend today, and be all well. Merci.
Agradeço a ministra Michele.
Thank you very much, Justice Michele Bonsoy. Incredible lecture exposition with very complete panorama on her vision of the situation regarding, well, the Canadian situation in regards to this. And it's very interesting, the links and comparisons with other legal situations in regards to original Indigenous peoples. Thank you very much and congratulations.
Thank you.
So we will now listen to Davi Copenau, writer and Yanomami leader in Shaman.
Perdão. Me explica o ministro Benjamin.
Justice Benjamin just told me he will be back in a second. So we will instead hand over now to Professor Gerald Torres. He is environmental justice law professor at the Yale Law School, with also a law professor at the Faculty of Law, pioneered in environmental area. He dedicated his career analyzing the intrinsic connection between the environment, agricultural systems and food systems, and social justice. A little bit about what our first speaker spoke about between interdependence. His research about race and ethnicity affect environmental policies and has been influential in the environmental justice field as a whole. His work also studies conflicts under the management of resources between indigenous tribes, American ones, states, and the federal government. Previously, Torres taught at the law faculty at Cornell, of the University of Texas as well, and the law faculty of the University of Minnesota, acting as associate dean. He's also ex-president of the Faculty Associations of American Law and as joint prosecutor in the Division of Environment and Natural Resources of the Justice Department of the U.S. during the Clinton government. It's a great pleasure to hear you, Professor Gerald.
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to thank my good friend Justice Benjamin for extending the invitation to me. I hope I don't disappoint him. I hope I don't disappoint any of you. I want to do a couple of things today, and hope I get to some good conclusions. We'll see. But I want to start by talking about the necessity of understanding the colonial project that the various European powers used in colonizing primarily, I'm thinking primarily about the Western Hemisphere, but obviously the globe. And we need to think about that. Second, I'm going to look at the way the various individual countries institutionalized the treatment of indigenous people within primarily North America, since that's where I've been focusing. And then I want to turn to the question of culture. And when I turn to the question of culture and cultural preservation, the one thing I want everyone to bear in mind is that culture doesn't exist outside of its material conditions, the material relations. So there's a concrete and material dimension to culture. And unless you consider that, my own view is that you're not taking the commitment to cultural diversity, cultural pluralism seriously. And then finally, I hope to conclude with the question of what the continuing challenges are. I suppose that could be the whole subject of the talk in general. But let's start at the beginning. Okay. When North America was colonized, and I said I'm going to focus on North America, but we'll see whether we can generalize the Western Hemisphere in particular. But let's see if we can generalize off of that. The colonial project of Britain, France, and Spain and Portugal all had differences, and understanding the differences in the project allow us to understand the initial relationships between the European powers and the people they encountered. Even at the beginning, international law mattered in the colonial projects. The Spanish, of course, engaged in a very deep debate over whether the inhabitants that they encountered were actually people, and if they were people, what did that mean in terms of the legal responsibility of the colonizers to the inhabitants that they encountered. The North America did not have a deep philosophical discussion of the status of the inhabitants, but rather viewed them more as an impediment or as traders initially. You know, it's interesting because, and there's slight divergence, because there was a debate in Britain over whether the Irish were humans and whether they had to treat the Irish as people worthy of humanitarian concerns when Britain colonized Ireland. So the debate over the people that you're encountering and what legal obligations might obtain by your characterization of those people is as old as colonization itself. Now, David Hume, in 1757, said something that I think is actually important. In a letter he wrote that the return voyage of Columbus marks the commencement of modern history. So modern history began when Christopher Columbus stepped off the gangplank on his return voyage from the Western Hemisphere. And so we could say that the encounter with indigenous people, in fact, is the marking point, the point at which the modern world commenced. And so the treatment and the relationship between indigenous people and the colonizers really have an important role to play in defining both the political culture, the economy that followed from that political culture, and the continuing expressions of how we integrate both ethical and moral dimensions to the law that we apply. So in the United States, the British, when they first encountered Native people on the Eastern Seaboard, there was a couple of problems because they weren't just Native people they were encountering other Europeans who were there first. And what they did was to rely on international law as a justification for claiming priority in dealing with the native people and in claiming the right to trade with, obtain, or otherwise possess the land owned by or claimed by native people, and certainly in New York, claimed by the Dutch. And so it's one way they could, in fact, dismiss the Dutch claims in Britain in the same way that they dismissed the native claims. Now, the doctrine of discovery, which is at the heart of this, of course, doesn't give the discovering nation, right, an absolute right to the territory. It merely gives them essentially a right of first refusal to obtain the underlying claim, the underlying title, as it were, to the property. But in the cases that lie at the heart of the American jurisprudence, which Canada, Australia have adopted in some measure, perform a kind of magic. And the justice in those trilogy of cases admits that it's magic. Because what he does is he says, we can convert discovery to conquest. And once you convert discovery to conquest, then the legal dimensions of the relationship between the colonizer and the person the inhabitants that you're encountering changes dramatically. So it's no longer a right of first refusal, that is a right to obtain the property from the people you're encountering. It is in fact a claim by virtue of conquest to the underlying property. And you reduce the claim of the original inhabitants to a claim of occupancy, or a claim that is completely dependent upon the relationship between the colonizing people and their need for, or lack thereof, for the property. Now, part of the colonizing project in British North America, and I'll exclude Canada for a second, we'll get to Canada. Part of the project was to build a political system, a polity, that explicitly excluded native people. So native people were pushed to the margins politically, but that had two important consequences. One, it excluded them from the creation of the political community that was being developed. Important. It also, though, led to a recognition of a pre-political existence for the native people that they were encountering. So it meant that the native people they were encountering represented political communities that had to be engaged and could be engaged through the mechanism that Western powers had at that point, or European powers had at that point, which was through the mechanism of treaties. And so there were varieties of treaties that were entered into that continued to have force, or did this or did that, were recognized or not recognized, but it created two political communities: the political community that was being created by European colonists and the political communities that pre-existed those European colonists. And what we see in modern law is an attempt to reconcile those competing communities. Similar events happened in Canada, although Canada was more robustly influenced by the presence of the French. And so the French had different ideas about how to manage native people. And in many ways, the Canadian-British approach to managing native people mirrored the United States or the Southern North American approach, but it had some differences, and I'll talk about those in a minute. Mexico, on the other hand, adopted the Spanish approach, which was to not recognize the native people they encountered as anything but subjects to the crown. So it did not recognize them as having a pre-political existence. It instead made them subjects to the crown, although it did as an outgrowth of that political and philosophical debate they had, come to the conclusion that they could not enslave them, but instead used a very elaborate form of labor contracting, as it were, to produce the equivalent of enslavement for Native people. It's important to recognize here that the Spanish, at least in southern North America, Florida, Texas, et cetera, and in Mexico proper, encountered many millions of indigenous people and encountered quite sophisticated legal systems. And in fact, the administrative system of the Spanish was built on top of the administrative system that the Aztec Empire had in place in Mexico. So you have that kind of layered politics. Recently, Mexico has moved, as a lot of Latin America has moved, in the direction of recognizing constitutional pluralism. So you have in Ecuador, right, the plurinationalism as a constitutional vision. In Mexico, you have constitutional pluralism as the modern emerging vision of how the society should be organized, still not recognizing explicitly a separate political existence, although for the various native nations within Mexico. But of course, they have recognized some, and we can talk about that in detail if you'd like. But the problem in Mexico, or one of the problems in Mexico, is that the idea of cultural constitutional pluralism is not uniformly enforced. So you'll have some states that have a robust commitment to integrating Native people into the political system of the particular state, and through that into the nation. And you'll have other states where there is lip service with virtually no commitment to integrating the Native people that they're encountering into the political system. So despite the stated commitment to constitutional pluralism, the effect is uneven. Now, in the last speaker made a couple of important statistical observations, and one that I'd like to suggest is a continuing effect, at least in the United States, of the colonization of Native people, is the relationship between the police and Native people. So many of you are undoubtedly familiar with the movement Black Lives Matter and the statistics relating to the effect of police uneven police enforcement of the powers in relationship to African American communities. In fact, as a proportion of the population, the number of Native people killed by the police is, in fact, the largest group of people killed by the police in North America. But it's not generally thought of or remembered or considered in that way. So I want to return, though, briefly to the question of treaties, because treaties represent the way in which the Native people were integrated into the broader political project, because they're essentially orthogonal to the constitutional structure of the United States. But the important difference, between their relationship to the non-Native political culture in the United States and the relationship of Native people to the political culture in Canada is actually, I think, important. Because if you assume that Native nations have an independent political existence, then they have a kind of sovereign claim that is not dependent upon the claim of the non-native government. One of the interesting things about Canada is that the sovereignty that the native people exercise in Canada is derivative of the sovereignty of the Crown that is played through the Canadian government. So and that issue is still being worked out. But it's an interesting idea of how sovereignty works. But in some ways, it's also reflective of the way in which the Western colonization in Canada and the United States were different and thus produced distinct political consequences. Now, one of the interesting things, and I think this conference is exemplary of it, is we are in a, and you'll excuse me, Antonio, if you disagree with this characterization, I'm Justice Benjamin, excuse me, but we're in an indigenous moment legally. And the question, the hard legal question is, what does the recognition of the claims that indigenous people are making globally have on the existing institutional structure that Western and non-Western nations have in relationship to the political culture that exists there? And that's the hard question and a really important question. I think that indigenous people put aside the material dimensions just in terms of the jurisprudence in these countries. That's the really hard question, and that's where the expansive commitments to human rights, in particular, will emerge. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the various other international documents that have recognized a number of rights that indigenous people have typically include a right to culture. And one of the things that is both problematic for non-indigenous political communities is that the right to culture necessarily implies a right to the material conditions to support and generate and improve or develop the culture that Native people have. So it's not a claim that they have the right to exercise their cultural expressions. It's not a speech claim as such. It's a claim to the material resources in order to produce and to reproduce and develop their cultural heritage. That means that at heart, the hard part of the bargain that is going to emerge, and is emerging in places like New Zealand, is what's the relationship? What's the relationship between the protection of the culture for indigenous people and the claims that those people can make on the material assets of the nations within which they inhabit? Those aren't easy questions. They're very hard questions. But as the case of the Awastini demonstrate, they're not impossible to answer. They're not impossible to answer. In fact, they can be answered by resort to the very mechanisms that we have to resolve legal disputes. So that case, which some of you may or may not know, it involved the granting by the government of Nicaragua of a timber concession to a Japanese company. Before the Japanese could exercise that concession, the Awastini community said, no, the state of Nicaragua doesn't have the authority to give away property, assets, that are in fact ours. The Nicaraguan government said, well, you don't have a property claim to the territory within which that timber is located that suggests that we have to treat it legally the way you're asking us to treat it. And so in the Indian Commission, there was a litigation. The anthropologists were involved, but a couple of things emerged. One is that, in fact, there were multiple claimants to the territory that was part of the timber concession, multiple claimants by various native communities. But the claimants all used that territory in different ways. So it was true that the Awastini did not occupy that territory in a way that would be easily understood by non-native communities. But it was also true that they did occupy it and use it in cooperation with other native communities in a way that took it off the ledger sheet of assets that the state could dispose of. That was an important insight, because what it meant was we could use the tools that we have to adjudicate disputes to recognize claims, property claims, that would otherwise have been scoffed at or dismissed. So the challenge then, since I'm almost out of time, the challenge is for us to ask each other, how can we take the tools within the law that we understand and use them in a way that is consistent with the ethical and moral dimensions of the results of colonization that produce justice, and produce justice in a way that allows us to provide the dignity to all of the communities that the law is supposed to guarantee. So thank you.
Professor Geraldo fez apanhado sociológico, antropológico também, sobre princípios que marcaram essa relação dos povos originários com os colonizadores. Muito interessante sua exposição.
Extremely interesting from the legal point of view as well as the humanistic point of view.
Bastante conclusiva também.
Quite conclusive as well, with this closing on this indigenous moment, but making we non-indigenous think about the future. Where do we point our canoe to, as the first speaker alluded? Now we will listen to Davi Kopenawa. Davi Kopenawa, a shaman, a political leader of the Yanomami people, president of Utukara Yanomami Association, an activist in the defense of indigenous people and of the Amazon rainforest. Not only is he an author, scriptwriter, and speaker, he's one of the intellectual, political, and spiritual leaders, one of the most important leaders in the contemporary context in the defense of native peoples, of the environment, of cultural diversity, and of human rights, recognized nationally and internationally. He's also the author of The Fall of the Heavens, Words of a Yanomami Shaman from 2010, in fellowship with the French anthropologist Bruce Albert. So now we will listen with such pleasure to the words of Davi Kopenawa.
Hey, Nabuamaku, Omakmanisia Manha, Omaklaki, Omakyamataki. Habanaya Kubihio, Omaneke, Oniplayaro, Nahapadakurayoma, Uriteri. Uriteria kudana ya wasipai ayakuma. Acho que é boa noite, né? Já está.
Good evening. I think it's night already. Good evening, everyone. It's already dark. Good evening, leaders.
Acho que tem os professores.
We have teachers here, right? Good evening, teachers,
Professoras e antropólogos.
anthropologists,
E nós, liderança,
and we, indigenous leaders,
estamos aqui nessa casa.
we're all here
Eu falei
in this
pouquinho
home.
Yanomami.
I was speaking a little bit in Yanomami.
Eu gosto de falar, porque é a
I
minha
like
língua, porque é
speaking it because it's my
a
language.
minha alma aqui
It's my soul.
está aqui comigo,
It's here with me.
alma da
It's the soul
Chapiri.
of the Kopenawa, Shapiri. It's my soul as a shaman.
Eu estou muito contente,
And I'm very glad,
muito mesmo,
very glad indeed,
e nós estamos
that
aqui
we are here
conversando sobre
talking
as problemas,
about these problems.
as problemáticos,
The problems
o não indígena que vieram
that the non-indigenous who came here
trazendo os problemas.
and brought these problems.
Por isso nós estamos assim contar
And
como
that's why
aconteceu,
we're here to tell it
como
how it happened. And it happened when they got here, when they arrived.
Eu sempre falo
I always say,
que vocês falaram sobre
and as others have said,
colonização,
I always talk about
colonizadores.
colonization, colonizers,
Eu sonhei
and
como
I
eles
dreamt
vieram preparados.
of how they came, well prepared.
Eles são recentes invasores.
They are recent invaders.
Mais 500 anos passados, muitos anos passados.
500 long years have gone through. 500 years ago, we didn't have these problems.
O meu povo Yanomami
My
conta
people, the Yanomami, tell our history,
ancestrais.
our ancestral history.
E falaram que não
They
tinha
said
chegado ainda
that
os homens.
these men hadn't come yet, the white men.
Eu aprendi os parentes.
I learned this from older shamans.
Porque eles falaram que
They
quando ele
said
chegou,
that when the white
olha,
men
esse
arrived, they
branco,
said,
branco, aí eles pegaram o nome.
we're white.
Certo.
So we took that name for them, the white people.
É importante, nós
So,
estamos aqui,
It's important for us to be here
essa casa, a nosso
in
mundo,
this place
a nossa
to
Criador
say that
se
our
chama
world,
Mama.
our creator is called
O Mama
Omama.
está escutando.
Omama's listening to
Ele não
us.
está assim parecendo, mas você está
You
escutando.
might not see him here, but he's listening.
O som da terra,
Just like we listen to the sound of the
barulho da
earth,
trovão, barulho
to the
do mundo.
noise of the thunder, to the noises of the world. He also listens to us.
E a sociedade não indígena
Non-indigenous
precisa,
society
sonhar,
needs to dream,
precisa sonhar a
needs
nossa
to
cultura
dream
terra.
a culture of the earth,
Grande alma da floresta,
dream of the great soul of the forest of our Brazil.
está faltando isso.
That's what's missing.
E aqui
And here
em Brasília tem
in
muita
Brasilia,
gente
there are many people
que não
who
reconhece
do not
o meu povo
recognize
originário,
my
não
people,
reconhece o meu
do not
povo indígena do
recognize
Brasil.
the indigenous people of Brazil.
Nunca chegou lá na minha casa.
They've never come to my home, never.
Eu chego aqui para
I
falar
come
com
here
vocês.
to speak to you.
Vocês
come
nem
to your
conhecem
home.
nem quantos
You don't even
cabelos
know
dos povos originários
how
que
many
tem.
heads of people there are in the originary populations. The authorities have never walked on foot to reach our villages where we work, where we struggle, where we continue to protect our forest, where we continue to do everything that we do to protect the land, protect the forest, waters, the streams, the lakes, waterfalls, the sea, and everything else. We protect the soul of our land, the planet, the great soul of our land is our sustainment. It takes care of us. So, the indigenous society came from far away. They reached here. They liked this place. And then the indigenous society took this land from the original people who were here 500 years ago. We can say that.
Eu vou explicar o que é perigo para nós.
I'm going to explain what is the danger for us. Danger that is on planet Earth, that is for planet Earth. The Europeans, Americans, foreigners are always constantly talking about climate change. When I was small, like 10 years old, I never heard talk about in non-indigenous society about climate change. I got here in Brasília in 1988.
Nosso parente Chavante era
And our brother Chavan was the first indigenous federal congressman. I met him, I knew him a little. And our leader, tribe leader, Hauni, our chief Hauni, is a warrior, a defender of forests, a defender of our great soul. A defender of everything that we see, that we use, everything that we'd like this place. This is the role of our leaders and leadership. But traditional leaders don't write on paper. They don't have to, or they need to. So what we need is have this traditional knowledge, the history, remembered here, it stays here in our mind, in our memory. We're different. Us, original people in Brazil, indigenous people in Brazil are very different. Your land is there in Europe. Mine is here. This is our motherland. Mother Earth that took care of us, and so we take care of it. And that is why we always complain and say to non-indigenous people or society that they are not respecting. They're not respecting our waterfalls, our forests, the environment. The forest is life. You know that very well.
Eu vou colocar o que é perigo tem.
So, another danger.
Motokari será a sociedade indígena do
Motokari. So Motokari would be the indigenous society that lives here in Brazil, in Brasília.
Você já sonhou? Motokari? Não, Motokari não, é Motokari. Motokari é que o sol
So Motokari
chega para fazer seca de floresta. Muita gente da cidade
There
fica
are a lot
reclamando
of people of the city, rich people,
nossa terra,
that Motokari
floresta, e a sociedade começa a reclamar.
is going close to the forest, so the sun is coming too close, or everything's getting hot, it's changing. We have climate change happening.
Muita gente fala isso.
A lot of people say that.
Que é mais forte, muito forte, se chama topano.
But what is stronger, much stronger, is called Topano. Have you heard of Topano? Other indigenous peoples, have you heard of Topano?
Que nós Yanomami conhece.
Topano is what us Yanomami know. It's only the tribe chief that knows it. Us Yanomami do not recognize this danger that is in the sky, the sun, or under the earth, the lands.
Sociedade não indígena, vamos muito cuidado.
Non-indigenous society, careful.
Você já viu, vocês estão vendo, o televisão passa, televisão ele
You see on the TV only shows a little bit of what the forest burning. They are burning a forest, killing thousands of small trees.
E a terra fica queimada, virando cinza.
And so the land is scorched and becoming
Eu aprendi
cinders, ashes.
Eu aprendi sabedoria do nosso mundo, a machia da terra.
I learned knowledge of our lands, of the forests.
Para você muito cuidado.
So I'm passing this message to you. Careful.
Chega de brincadeira.
Enough messing
Vamos
around.
trabalhar outra coisa.
Let's
Vocês vão trabalhar
work on something else.
roçado, planta arroz,
Go.
soja.
You come to our backyards, you plant rice, soy, you raise cattle,
Peixe e muitas comidas que a gente
poultry, and fish, and many things that we
não pode
eat.
derrubar mais.
But we cannot fell more
Aprende,
trees.
pessoal.
Learn.
Nós não somos criança, não. Nós somos adultos.
We're not children,
Vamos
we're
cuidar, vamos
adults.
cuidar nosso mundo, Brasil.
Let's take care of our world, Brazil.
Essa topana, quando ele chega,
Opano,
eles deixam secar os carapés.
he lets the streams
Carapé, o rio,
dry, the rivers,
lago,
lakes,
e secando, e o peixe começar
drying,
a morrer.
and the fish start dying. It's too dry, too hot,
E o povo também começa a adoecer.
and people all start getting sick.
Falta água, fica tomando
There's
muita
lack of
água.
water, drinking too much water.
O planeta Terra começando a adoecer.
Planet Earth starts getting sick.
Nós, Xabiri e Yanomami,
Us Shabiri Yanomami, we're fighting.
nós estamos lutando, tomando Yacuana,
We're fighting,
contato com a grande Omama,
being in touch with great Omama, the creator.
junto com ele.
We are with them.
Isso aí eu queria deixar a mensagem.
This
pra
is the
você.
message I'd like to leave you with.
Topano não se brinca.
We cannot mess around with Topano.
Fica abaixo da terra.
Topano is the fire that is
Eu acho que
underneath
você já viu,
the earth,
todo
the
mundo
lands. I
sabe
think
aonde que
everyone has already
fogo.
seen where fire comes from.
Sim. Fogão, isso? Fogão. Lá, outro lado é vulcão, sim,
volcans.
mas aqui no Brasil também tem.
Volcanoes.
Você não está aparecendo porque nós, Yanomami, Xabiri, tá trabalhando para
Volcanoes, because we Yanomamis are working so that doesn't happen.
não deixar acontecer.
To ensure that that doesn't happen. Not have too much fire that burns the forests.
Lembra, saiu a fumaça
Remember
Paulo,
the smoke that we had in São Paulo here in Brazil?
mundo fica assustado.
Everyone was really scared.
Sem Yanomami, sem Xabiri, Yanomami,
Without Yanomami, without the Xabiri Yanomami,
volta na base do Brasil, você vai adoecer muito.
everyone will get very sick. Get sick with lack of fresh air,
Fumaça no nariz.
smoke going into your nostrils, everyone will be very sick.
Esse que eu tô querendo, eu tô falando para vocês.
This is what I say to you. Careful.
Esse aí, a minha fala. Aitan, Chimaribô, também são perigosos.
Chibariubo might be dangerous.
Inverno e verão.
Winter and summer.
Já vi, todo mundo sabe, todo mundo viu.
Everyone's seen this. Everyone knows this.
Choveu muito,
It rained
muita chuva,
a lot, far too much,
também encheu o rio.
and the river
Encheu o
overflowed.
lago, encheu o
Lakes
Carapé,
got
encheu o
full,
Rio Grande,
streams,
e encheu mar.
and
Quando encher
the
mar,
seas. And once the seas start getting full,
entra água na cidade.
water will go into the cities.
Já entrou lá no Rio Grande do
It
Sul.
already happened in Rio Grande do
Você já
Sul,
viu, né?
the state of Rio Grande do Sul. You
Você não
saw,
viu.
or did you not see?
Essa que eu estou dando a mensagem para vocês.
So this is what I wish to impart to you.
Está dando para isso aí. Se continuar, destruir a
If we
terra,
continue
destruir
destroying
com, garimpo
Earth
ilegal,
with
na terra
illegal
indígena,
mining in indigenous lands,
mineração na terra indígena,
mining in indigenous
marco
lands,
temporal na terra indígena,
with the
e outros
timeline thesis
que
and other things
sociedade indígena
that the indigenous
estão atrás. Tem
society are not responsible
Fica querendo
for,
mais.
and the other sides want more, want to exploit more.
Então, vamos muito cuidado.
Let's be careful.
Eu estou dando para você, eu estou dando a mensagem do Xabiri.
I'm bringing you Shabiri's message. I'm a shaman.
Eu nunca entrei na escola do governo.
I've studied, but I've never entered
Nunca
the
entrei na escola.
the
A minha escola
government school.
é floresta.
My school is the forest.
Na floresta tem material especial.
And in the forest, we have special
E abrir
materials. And I opened the path
caminho realidade nós Xabiri conhece.
to reality, of reality we know of. This path
Todo mundo não só para
is for everyone, not just the Yanomami or indigenous. It's for everyone.
terra,
For the earth, the world,
terra,
the
planeta.
planet.
Também os trovão estão reclamando, está com medo e nós estamos
The lightnings are also saying this, and they're afraid.
É
And
muito importante.
so our work is really important.
Essa história que o meu meu sogro,
This is the story that my father-in-law, a great shaman of the Yamami lands, prepared me to fight, defend.
Estou fazendo bom trabalho, parte para vocês.
We're doing work, and in part is for you, for the Yanomami, for the forest, for the mountains, for the fish, the bees,
As árvores,
trees.
porque eu aprendi com o pai, o mama, O Mamo falou para ele, olha,
That was, I learned, and he said, Opinawa,
ser guerreiro.
you're going to be a warrior
Guerreiro para proteger o pulmão,
to
o pulmão da
protect
terra,
the
a pulmão da
planet's
floresta,
lungs,
pulmão
the
da
lungs of the forest,
conhecimento ancestrais.
of the ancestral knowledge.
E o não indígena chegaram aqui,
The non-indigenous have arrived and now are destroying a lot. And why are they destroying? Because they want money. They don't want forests, they don't want water. White people are simply and only in love with money.
Muita gente. Já acabou. Então, será que você está entendendo o que eu estou falando?
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Meu jeito.
I'm saying it my way, the way that I learned. The way that I learned your language. I'm not speaking in my mother tongue. I'm speaking the European people of Portugal, right?
E a embaixada está aqui no Brasil, representando a Europa.
And you're here in Brazil representing Europe.
Esse trabalho é muito importante.
Well, this work is really important. Today, a Brazilian indigenous person are no longer alone. Many partners. And that's why we're sat here. And for you to learn more about my speech, my talk.
É muito importante crescer número.
It's very important that we increase the number of warriors. Warriors for the land, for the Amazon forest. Let's fight, let's walk side by side with the birds, with the macaws, the bees, they work and walk side by side. And so should we and must we work and take care of our house, our home. Let us teach our children. If our children do not learn, they will suffer. The future will not be protected. Their future will not be protected, it will be ruined. From now on, the forest in Brazil will become a football field. I know that you want that. You don't want forests. You want it for food such as açaí, nuts. Don't you eat fish? So let's take care of that. It's not just for cattle. Cattle are deforesting our Amazon forest. Because the cattle is the one who actually tells the farmer what to do. So I'm here to talk about the indigenous, talk about our children, foreign children as well. They shouldn't need or have to learn to say mining. The word mining is death, it's a disease. Big mining and having it come into our houses, our homes is impossible. Shouldn't happen. In Yanomami lands? No. It cannot. You want to mine, do it in your home. That's what I wanted to say to you. And so we Yanomami are taking care
essa chuva que eu falei, vamos cuidar.
This rain that I
A
mentioned,
floresta acabar, vai chover muito daqui para
let's
frente.
take
Daqui
care of things
50
because
anos
it's
pra
going to
frente,
rain a lot.
vai acontecer isso.
In 50 years, it's going to be even more. And the other, Yaripora.
Yaripora, este chama temporal. Né?
Yaripora is the storm.
Temporal.
Storm.
Você já viu temporal? Você
So
já
you've
pegou
seen
temporal
storms.
forte?
Have you seen strong
Eu acho
storms?
que você nunca viu.
I think you
Temporal
might
tá
not.
embaixo da terra.
The storm is
outro tá no
under the
céu.
earth, the other is in the skies. If the Yanomami die,
Tudo de doença, de malária,
diseases, malaria, etc.
terra,
The storms will come from under the earth, will go to all the forests.
floresta está ser plantado o Denarromacu. A floresta derrubaram, agora os brancos estão plantando.
The forests
Reflorestamento
were cut down, and now the whites are trying to reforest, to
só
plant,
para fazer dinheiro.
just to again
Reflorestamento
earn or win money. And the reforestation even still is not enough. The tropical forests,
de verdadeiro floresta
real,
que está
true
segurando a
forests
nossa
that
terra
are still sustaining our
para não
planet.
equilibrar. Yaripora
So the storm Yaripora
está paciência. Daqui para frente,
is
Xabir e morrer
not
tudo,
patient anymore. From here onwards,
Yaripora vai se vingar.
if we
Yaripora
Yanomami
vai
die,
fazer guerra.
Yaripora, the storm will
Yaripora não vai,
take its
Yaripora não
revenge,
vai
will
usar bomba
war us.
ou bomba.
It's not going to
Ele
use
vai usar
bombs.
outro arma.
It's going to use another weapon.
Isso que eu estou contando para você lembrar.
This is
daqui
what
pra
I'm telling
frente,
you so that you can remember from here onwards.
Se acontecer, olha, Davi deu mensagem
If it should happen,
nós tudo.
remember,
Começar a derrubar,
he
aí vai
sent us a
começar
message, and so then
falar num televisão,
you're going to
vai
start
acontecer,
talking about it in the
quebraram
TV.
a terra, não quebraram a casa, derrubaram a casa, morreu muita criança.
Many children
vai-
died, destroyed our
a televisão
homes.
vai
The
começar
TV
a
will
falar
start to
isso.
say that.
Então é por isso que estou aproveitando.
That's why I'm taking this opportunity that the authorities are here.
Obrigado.
Thank you very much.
Ministro
Justice Benjamin,
Herman, muito obrigado.
Justice
Pata.
Herman,
Vamos
Benjamin
continuar.
Herman,
Vamos lutar.
we're going to
Coragem,
continue fighting.
porque
Let's be
nosso
courageous.
Brasil.
Let's be brave
É nosso
because it's
país.
our Brazil, it's our
É
country,
nosso.
it's ours.
Outros vêm aqui
Others come here,
estragar, tirar a riqueza.
they
e levar
will
a
ruin
riqueza
it,
pra
extract
casa
the
deles.
riches, take it to their houses or homes,
Fica pobre.
and our lands
Não deixar,
are poor,
não
impoverished.
podemos deixar a terra pobre,
We cannot
sem
leave,
comida,
allow the land to
sem
be
árvore.
impoverished without the food, without the
Não
trees,
podemos
without
deixar.
the
Ministro, vamos
game.
trabalhar, porque é a nossa.
Justice,
A
let's
nossa terra
work.
mãe, aonde nós
This is our Mother Earth,
nascemos,
where we were
nós vamos
born,
continuar nascendo,
our children, so that our children can continue
nova geração
being born and living,
pode continuar
so that new
lutar
generation can continue
sem medo, é a
fighting
nossa
without fear
casa.
because it's our home.
Se venha outros estrangeiros,
If other foreigners come, Americans,
europeus,
Europeans,
vocês falaram aí,
all those that you've spoken of,
histórico,
you told
vai
this
acabar,
history,
porque
story,
lá,
it's gonna
Europa
finish.
não tem mais terra pra ele,
because Europe no longer has
não,
their
nem
forests,
água,
not even water
nem capim. Eles plantam, mas
or
tá
grass. They plant, but it's
secando.
drying.
Então,
I know
aqui o
about
Brasil
this.
é muito rico, rico de saúde,
Brazil is very rich, rich
de
in
água,
health and
rico de
water,
chuva,
in
rico de
rains,
energia boa,
good energy,
limpo.
clean energy.
Agora, só chegar máquinas pesadas,
If you arrive with heavy machinery,
vai começar a adoecer, morrer.
It's going to start getting
Essa
sick.
terra,
Our lands will
a
start
terra tá
dying.
cheia de buraco.
The land is full of holes.
A sociedade fica falando, eu tô
Society keeps
escutando,
speaking, talking.
tô
I hear it, I
sabendo.
know. I can hear.
A ministra Damares está lutando contra
Minister
Brasil,
Damares,
contra meu povo, contra meus guerreiros. Isso não pode.
Congresswoman Damaris is fighting against my people,
Pode.
my
Ela
warriors.
está doente.
That's not possible.
Nós,
She's
saberes,
sick.
estamos devendo. Ninguém vai deixar, não.
Us Shabiri
É
people will not allow that.
reconhecido do Brasil e fora.
That is known in Brazil and
É
outside
reconhecido
and abroad.
no Brasil e fora, no mundo. A
In
nossa
Brazil,
terra mãe está de
in the
olho.
world, Mother Earth is
Agora,
watching
não
us.
deixa acontecer. É a vingança da terra. Eu não quero
The
deixar
revenge of the earth. I don't want
porque a
this
minha
to
casa está
happen and
perto.
take place because my
Se
home is
acontecer,
here.
vai ficar ruim
Should that
para nós, para
happen,
todo
it's
mundo.
going to be bad for everyone.
Então, essa aí é a minha mensagem
So that's my
para
message
vocês.
to you.
Eu estou muito contente.
Very
que vocês estão
happy that you're
escutando.
listening to me.
Eu também aprendi com
I also
vocês.
learned from you.
Você teve a oportunidade essa vez, mas
I
demorou
had
muito,
the
mas
opportunity this
deu
time. It took
já
a
para
long time, but
chegar aqui.
took me a long time to get here.
Vamos, é muito importante
It's very
aproximar.
important
Senhor
to get
ministro, vamos
closer.
aproximar.
I'll
Nós
tell you
temos
this,
que
Justice.
aproximar
We're warriors.
os
Let
Yanomami,
the
Kayapó,
Yanomami, the Kayapó come together, come closer. The
Chavante,
Shavanchi,
Tinguano,
Iguano,
Macuxi,
the
Wapichana
Makoshi,
e Caricó.
Wapishana, Caricó.
Vamos
Let us
aproximar
all get closer
para ser forte,
so
para
that we
não
can be
deixar
stronger,
acontecer isso.
to not let
Nós
all of
estamos
this
morrendo de
happen.
fome,
There are people starving,
nós estamos satios, a terra cuida de nós, a
so
floresta cuida de
the
nossa
land
saúde.
takes care of us, the forest takes care of
A
our
floresta
health,
cuida da nossa
the forest
vida.
takes care of our lives.
Aui, Elilema, Natakutalma, Tamablarioma. E essa é a minha fala, só
That's
pouquinho.
what I had to
Aui,
say, or a
muito
little bit of
obrigado.
what I have
Boa
to say.
noite.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Eu acho que conseguimos
I
resumir
think that we are able to summarize
com citação do Copenau.
extraordinary
Ele disse: a floresta
speech by Copenau in the sense that he said, the forest is my school. The forest was my school. It is my school.
e ele realmente
And
sabe
he
tudo
really
da
knows
floresta,
everything
nos deu
of the
aqui
forest.
panorama
He gave us
muito
a
interessante
very
sobre
interesting
a visão
panorama,
da defesa
wide-reaching view
que os povos originários
of
fazem
the
da
defense
vida, né?
that
E
indigenous
incitou
people
todos
make
nós
of
a
life.
refletirmos sobre
And he incited all of us to
o caminho
reflect
que estamos
on the
seguindo,
path
qual é
that
a
we are
posição que
in.
devemos
What is the
tomar.
position
Ele
that we
disse mais
should take?
tema muito
Something
interessante,
else very
muita
interesting that he
gente
mentioned is
de
that
grandes cidades
people
falam
from the
sem
big cities
conhecer
speak
o que
and
está
they
acontecendo
don't go there to know what's going on,
do
to understand the reality
do mundo
of
da floresta.
the world of the
Eu, como
forest.
disse no início,
As I
tive
said in
lá
the beginning,
e vi
I was
realmente
there and I saw that really
desafio incrível
there's
você
so
poder
much to know. It's
verificar
an
uma
amazing
passeio
opportunity to learn,
entrega
to
de centenas
in my case, I went there to
registros de
deliver
documento, de
hundreds
registros civil,
of
de certidões de
civil
casamento
documents,
para
marriage
que
certificates,
essa
IDs,
cidadania
so
possa ser
that they could
exercida
exercise their
dentro dos
citizenship
costumes e
within
dentro da
the
cultura
customs and
indígena. Então, nós
culture of the
tivemos essa
indigenous group. So we
oportunidade
had that
de
opportunity
visitar
of visiting.
lá em Belém de
In this
Solimões,
case, it
né?
was Belém de
No mato de
Solimões in
Tabatinga.
the
Nós tivemos a oportunidade de pegar
municipality of
um barco,
Tabatinga. We
visitar lá,
had the
subir o barco
opportunity of
e
taking a
conhecermos
boat and getting to know a little bit
essa
of this
extraordinária
extraordinary
forma de ver o mundo
way of
que
seeing the
ainda é
world.
mantida, preservada. Também tivemos algumas
We also
denúncias
had a
de
few
abuso,
accusations of abuses
quando estávamos na
when we
corregedoria
were in the comptroller's office, especially the undue adoption of children from the municipalities in the countryside of the Amazon to be brought to various countries throughout the world. We went there and we stopped that with the support of the judiciary power. I went to the São Gabriel da Cachoeira. I'm sure you've been there as well, where there are various warnings from the judiciary power in their languages. So that was very interesting to get to know the way that judges listen to the statements of indigenous people, how they were able to foster people who needed the justice sector. So it was very interesting to see those judicial districts in the forest. And once again, I'd like to congratulate the National High Court, STJ, for this initiative. I was very glad to participate in this panel. I learned so much from these speakers on extremely innovative themes, and it is the role of our court to intensify and motivate debates that involve citizenship, especially of the indigenous people. And now we have this little leaflet discussing the precedents that the court has produced regarding this theme. Congratulations, Chief Justice. Thank you so much for this invitation. I am honored. And I think we still have a photographic exhibit to see. And tomorrow is a long day with a lot of great activities. Thank you so much. Good evening. Now I give the floor back to the Chief Justice, Herman Benjamin. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Vice Chief Justice, Luiz Felipe Salomão, who was a colleague of mine in law school. He says he's younger than me. Very little. Oh, I was there a few years later. Oh yeah, we were there in law school together in Rio. So I think that finishing this opening panel was amazing. It was really global. We had all sorts of different time zones, from New Zealand to here, Canada. So from the eastern and western hemispheres. So we have time zones from all over the world. Listening to Davi Copenau is always extremely enlightening. Justice Sebastião Reis and Justice Paulo Sérgio Domingues, when we visited Davi and his institution in Boa Vista, we were there for so long that we almost missed our flight. And were it not for the flight, we would have stayed there for many more hours. And we went there together, the three of us, the first time that three justices of the National High Court visited the Yanomami people in an official visit from the National High Court. And we slept in their land. We visited there for 2 to 3 days. Of course, that's not enough. As Davi Copenau said, and I'd like to finish with your words that you said here today, Davi. The forest is life. And now in tone of alert to all of us, and he says, quote unquote, the earth is getting sicker and sicker. And finally, perhaps this phrase that touched me the most, Davi said, I don't want to let this happen, this vengeance of the earth on humanity, because my home is right there. That's extremely deep and poetic. And it gives us all the references that we need in law. Because to protect indigenous people, it's not us protecting them. We Brazilians want to protect. No, it's the Constitution, it's the laws that determine this, and we judges need to fulfill that. We're the first to have to fulfill the Constitution and laws of our nations. I'd like to finish, Justice Salomão, greeting everyone and thanking everyone. I'd like to thank Justice Maria Teresa, who's right over there. Justice Maria Teresa was the president of this court before me, and it was during her presidency that we carried out the first symposium on Indigenous Peoples Law. That is a court that's entitles itself the Court of Citizenship, had never discussed Indigenous Peoples Law. We discussed comparative law, we discussed other countries' law, we discussed international law, we discussed ancient Roman law, medieval law, but we had never opened our doors at the National High Court, the STJ, to this debate, which is so necessary on a theme which for me and for my colleagues who are here, Justice Marcelo Navarro, Justice Sebastião Reis, Justice Maria Teresa, Justice Luiz Felipe Salomão, for us, this theme is not just regarding our fundamental human rights, but also an existential theme. With that, I close this session. Let us go to the photo exhibition. There will be some food there, but the most important food that will be offered there is the food to the soul, because the extraordinary beauty of this exhibit of this amazing photographer and artist, Ricardo Stuckert. Let us go. All right. Good evening. See you tomorrow at 9 a.m.
Eu tomei em 2 lugares diferentes. Eu discuti só não fui à terra dele, porque ele estava voltando para Boa Vista.